Section 3 of A Year Amongst the Persians by Edward Granville Browne. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. A Year Amongst the Persians by Edward Granville Browne, Section 3. Chapter 2. From England to the Persian Frontier.
فما أدري إذا يممت أرضه أريد الخير أيهما يليني الخير الذي أنا أبتغيه أم الشر الذي هو يبتغيني. And I know not, when bound for the land of my quest, if my portion shall be the good which I hope for and seek, or the evil that seeketh for me. المثقب العبد. So at last I was ready to go to Persia. About that there could be no question, for I had long determined to go if I got the chance, and now not only had the opportunity come, but in view of the probability that the university would soon require a resident teacher of Persian, I was urged by my friends at Cambridge to spend the first year of my fellowship in the way which would best qualify me for this post. Yet, as the time for my departure approached, a strange shrinking from this journey which I had so much desired, a shrinking to which I look back with shame and wonder, and for which I can in no wise account, took possession of me. It arose partly, I suppose, from the sudden reaction which unexpected good fortune will at times produce, partly, if not from ill health, at least from that lowering of the vitality which results from hard work and lack of exercise and fresh air, partly also from the worry inseparable from the preparations for a long journey into regions little known. But, whatever its cause, it did much to mar my happiness at a time when I had no excuse for being otherwise than happy. At length, however, it came to an end. Bewildered by conflicting counsels as to the equipment which I should need and the route which I had best take, I at last settled the matter by booking my passage from Marseille to Batoum at the London office of the Messageries Maritimes, and by adding to the 2 small portmanteaus into which I had compressed so much clothing as appeared absolutely indispensable, nothing but a Wolseley valise, a saddle and a bridle, a pith hat which was broken to pieces long before the summer came round, a small medicine chest, a few surgical instruments, a revolver, a box of 100 cartridges, a few books, a passport with the Russian and Turkish visas, and a money belt containing about £200 in gold, paper, and circular notes. At the last moment I was joined by an old college friend, H., who, having just completed a term of office at the hospital, was desirous to travel, and whose proposal to join me I welcomed. He was my companion as far as Tehran, where, as I desired to travel for a while, and he to proceed, we were obliged to separate. We had booked our passage, as I have said, to Batoum, intending to take the train thence to Baku, and so by the Caspian to Rasht in Persia. For this route, unquestionably the shortest and easiest, I had from the first felt little liking, my own wish being to enter Persia through Turkey, either by way of Damascus and Baghdad, or of Trebizond and Erzurum. I had suffered myself to be persuaded against my inclinations, which, I think, where no question of principle is involved, is always a mistake, for the longer and harder way of one's own choosing is preferable to the shorter and easier way chosen by another. And so, as soon as I was withdrawn from the influences which had temporarily overcome my own judgment and inclination, I began to repent of having adopted an uncongenial plan, and to consider whether even now, at this 11th hour, it was not possible to change. The sight of the Turkish shore and the sound of the Turkish tongue, for we stayed 2 days at Constantinople, whence to Trebizond the deck of the steamer was crowded with Turks and Persians, with whom I spent the greater part of each day in conversing, swept away my last scruples as to the wisdom of thus reversing at the outset a decision which had been fully discussed. I consulted with H, who raised no objection, and we decided on reaching Trebizond, where the steamer anchored on 4th October, to inquire at the British consulate as to the safety and practicability of the old caravan road leading thence into Central Asia, and, if the report were favourable, to adopt that route. There was a heavy swell in the open roadstead, and the wind, which rolled back the rain clouds on the green, thickly wooded hills, seemed to be rising as we clambered into one of the clumsy boats which hovered round the steamer to go ashore, nor had the gruff old captain's answer to my inquiry as to how long the steamer would lie there tended to reassure me. "If the wind gets up much more," he had said, "I may start at any time." "And if we are on shore," I demanded, "how shall we know that you are starting?" "Vous me verrez partir, voilà tout," he replied, and with a shrug of his shoulders walked off to his cabin. So I was somewhat uneasy in my mind, lest, while we were conducting our inquiries on shore, the steamer might put out to sea, bearing with it all our worldly goods. This disquieting reflection was dispelled by the shock of the boat striking against the little wooden jetty. We stepped out and found ourselves confronted by one of the Turkish police, who demanded our passports. These had not been presented, as theoretically they should have been, at Constantinople for a fresh visa, and I feared we might consequently have some trouble in landing. However, I assumed an air of confident alacrity, produced the passports, and pointed to the seal of the Turkish consulate given in London. As the visa "Bon pour se rendre à Constantinople," to which this was attached, was in French, the officer was not much the wiser, and, after scrutinizing the passports, which he held upside down, with a critical air, he returned them and stood aside to let us pass. And this is typical of Turkey, where the laws, though theoretically stringent, are not practically troublesome, in which point it has the advantage over Russia. Guided by a boy belonging to our boat, we ascended through narrow, tortuous streets to the British consulate, where, though unprovided with recommendations, we received from the consul, Mr. Longworth, that courteous and kindly welcome which, to their honour be it said, Englishmen, and indeed other Europeans as well as Americans resident in the Turkish and Persian dominions, seldom fail to give the traveller. In reply to our inquiries, he told us that the road to the Persian frontier was perfectly safe, and that we should have no difficulty in hiring horses or mules to convey us to Erzerum, whence we could easily engage others for the journey to Tabriz. He also kindly offered to send his dragoman, an Armenian gentleman named Hekimian, to assist us in clearing our baggage at the custom house. So we returned to the steamer to bring it ashore. As we pushed our way through the deck passengers to the side of the ship, some of my Persian acquaintances called out to me to tell them why I was disembarking and whither I was going, and on learning my intention of taking the old caravan road through Erzerum, They cried, "Oh, dear soul, it will take you 3 months to get to Tehran thus, if indeed you get there at all. Why have you thus made your road difficult?" But the step was taken now, and I paid no heed to their words. The custom house, thanks to the aegis of the British consulate, dealt very gently with us. We were even asked, if I remember right, which of our packages we should prefer to have opened. H's Wolseley valise was selected, but we forgot that his rifle had been rolled up in it. The Turkish excisemen stroked their chins a little at this sight, for firearms are contraband, but said nothing. When this form of examination was over, we thanked the mudir, or superintendent, for his courtesy, gave a few small coins to his subordinates, and, with the help of 2 or 3 sturdy porters, transported our luggage to the one hotel which Trebizond possesses. It is called the Hôtel d'Italie, and, though unpretentious, is clean and comfortable. During the 3 days we spent there, we had no cause to complain either of being underfed or overcharged. Next morning our preparations began in earnest. Hekimion was of inestimable service, arranging everything and accompanying us everywhere. The Russian paper money with which we had provided ourselves for the earlier part of the journey was soon converted into Turkish gold. Tinned provisions and a few simple cooking utensils and other necessaries were bought in the bazaars, and arrangements were concluded with 2 sturdy muleteers for the journey to Erzurum. They, on their part, agreed to provide us with 5 horses for ourselves and our baggage, to convey us to Erzurum in 6 or 7 days, and to do what lay in their power to render the journey pleasant. While we were on our part covenanted to pay them 6¼ Turkish pounds, £3 down, and the remainder at Erzurum, to which we promised to add a trifle if they gave us satisfaction. There remained a more important matter, the choice of a servant to accompany us on our journey. 2 candidates presented themselves, an honest-looking old Turkish kavvas of the consulate, and a shifty Armenian, who, on the strength of his alleged skill in cookery, demanded exorbitantly high wages. We chose the Turk, agreeing to pay him £1 Turkish pound a week, to guarantee this payment for 6 months, and to defray his expenses back to Trebizond from any point at which we might finally leave him. It was a rash agreement, and might have caused us more trouble than it actually did, but there seemed to be no better alternative, seeing that a servant was an absolute necessity. The old Turk's real name was Omar, but, having regard to the detestation in which this name is held in Persia, for he whom Sunnite Mohammedans account the second caliph, or successor of the Prophet, is regarded by the sect of the Shia as the worst of evildoers and usurpers. It was decided that he should henceforth bear the more auspicious name of Ali, the darling hero of the Persian Shiites. The repetition of the following curse on the 3 first caliphs of the Sunnis is accounted by Persian Shiites as a pious exercise of singular virtue. O God, curse Omar, then Abu Bakr and Omar, then Othman and Omar, then Omar, then Omar. As for our old servant's character, viewed in the light of subsequent experience, I do him but justice when I express my conviction that a more honest, straightforward, faithful, loyal soul could not easily be found anywhere. But, on the other hand, he was rather fidgety, rather obstinate, too old to travel in a strange country, adapt himself to new surroundings and learn a new language, and too simple to cope with the astute and wily Persians, whom, moreover, religious and national prejudices caused him ever to regard with unconquerable aversion. This business concluded, we had still to get our passports for the interior. Hekimion accompanied us to the government offices, where, while a courteous old Turk entertained me with coffee and conversation, a shrewd-looking subordinate noted down the details of our personal appearance in the spaces reserved for that purpose on the passport. I was amused on receiving the document to find my religion described as English and my moustache as fresh, ter, but not altogether pleased at the entries in the head and chin columns, which respectively were taup, bullet-shaped, and deirmen, round. Before leaving the government house, we paid our respects to Sururi Effendi, the governor of Trebizond, one of the judges who tried and condemned the wise and patriotic Midhat Pasha. He was a fine-looking old man, and withal courteous, but he is reputed to be corrupt and bigoted. In the evening, at the hotel, we made the acquaintance of a Belgian mining engineer, who had lived for some time in Persia. The account which he gave of that country and its inhabitants was far from encouraging. "I have travelled in many lands," he said, "and have discovered some good qualities in every people, with the exception of the Persians, in whom I have failed to find a single admirable characteristic. Their very language bears witness against them, and exposes the sordidness of their minds. When they wish to thank you, they say, 'Lotfe shoma ziyad,' may your kindness be increased. That is, may you give me something more. And when they desire to support an assertion with an oath, they say, 'Bejan aziz khodat,' by thy precious life, or 'Bemarg shoma,' by your death. That is, may you die if I speak untruly." Apart from the doubtful justice of judging a people by the idioms of their language, it may be pointed out that, with regard to the two last expressions, they are based on the idea that to swear by one's own life or death would be to swear by a thing of little value compared to the life or death of a friend, and they would be as indifferent to your death as to the truth of their own assertions. Although we were ready to start on the following day, we were prevented from doing so by a steady downpour of rain. Having completed all our arrangements, we paid a visit to the Persian consulate, in company with Mr. Longworth. In answer to our inquiry as to whether our passports required his visa, the Persian consul signified that this was essential, and, for the sum of 1 Mejidiyeh apiece, endorsed each of them with a lengthy inscription so tastefully executed that it seemed a pity that, during the whole period of our sojourn in Persia, no one asked to see them. Though perfectly useless and unnecessary, the visa, as a specimen of calligraphy, was cheap at the price. Next day, Friday 7th October, the rain had ceased, and at an early hour we were plunged in the confusion without which, as it would seem, not even the smallest caravan can start. The muleteers, who had been urging us to hasten our preparations, disappeared so soon as everything was ready. When they had been found and brought back, it was discovered that no bridle had been provided for H's horse, for, though both of us had brought saddles from England, he had thought that it would be better to use a native bridle. Eventually, one was procured, and about 9 a.m. we emerged from the little crowd which had been watching our proceedings with a keen interest, and rode out of the town. Our course lay for a little while along the coast. until we reached the mouth of the valley of Khosh Oglan, which we entered, turning to the south. The beauty of the day, which the late rains had rendered pleasantly cool, combined with the novelty of the scene and the picturesque appearance of the people whom we met on the road, raised our spirits and completely removed certain misgivings as to the wisdom of choosing this route, which, when it was too late to draw back, had taken possession of my mind. The horses which we rode were good, and, leaving the muleteers and baggage behind, we pushed on until, at 2:30 p.m, we reached the pretty little village of Jevizlik, the first halting place out of Trebizond. Here we should have halted for the night, but since the muleteers had not informed us of their plans, and it was still early, we determined to proceed to Khamsekui, and accordingly continued our course up the beautiful wooded valley towards the pass of Zigona Dog, which gleamed before us white with newly fallen snow. During the latter part of the day, we fell in with a wild-looking horseman, who informed me that he, like all the inhabitants of Khamsekui, was a Christian. It was quite dark before we reached Khamsekui, and it took us some little time to find a khan at which to rest for the night. The muleteers and baggage were far behind, and at first it seemed probable that we should have to postpone our supper till their arrival, or else do without it altogether. However, Ali presently succeeded in obtaining some bread, and also a few eggs, which he fried in oil, so that, with the whiskey in our flasks, we fared better than might have been expected. At about 9 p.m, the muleteers arrived and demanded to see me at once. They were very tired and very angry because we had not waited for them at Jevizlik. I did not at first easily understand the cause of their indignation, for this was my first experience of this kind of travelling, and my ideas about the capacity of horses were rather vague, till it was explained to me that at the present rate of proceeding, both men and animals would be wearied out long before we reached Erzurum. "Oh, my soul!" said the elder muleteer in conclusion, more in sorrow than in anger. "A fine novice art thou, if thou thinkest that these horses can go so swiftly from morning till evening without rest or food. Henceforth, let us proceed in company at a slower pace, by which means we shall all, please God, reach Erzurum with safety and comfort in 7 days, even as was agreed between us." Not much pleased at being thus admonished, but compelled to admit the justice of the muleteer's remarks, I betook myself to the Wolseley valise, which I had, after much deliberation, selected as the form of bed most suitable for the journey. Excellent as this contrivance is, and invaluable as it proved to be, my first night in it was anything but comfortable, as I intended to stuff with straw the space left for that purpose beneath the lining. I had neglected to bring a mattress. Straw, however, was not forthcoming, and I was therefore painfully conscious of every irregularity in the ill-paved floor, while the fleas which invest most Turkish khans did not fail on this occasion to welcome the advent of the stranger. In spite of these discomforts and the novelty of my surroundings, I soon fell fast asleep. Looking back at those first days of my journey in the light of fuller experience, I marvel at the discomforts which we readily endured, and even courted by our ignorance and lack of foresight. Bewildered by conflicting counsels as to equipment, I had finally resolved to take only what appeared absolutely essential, and to reduce our baggage to the smallest possible compass. Prepared by what I had read in books of Eastern travel to endure discomforts far exceeding any which I was actually called upon to experience, I had yet to learn how comfortably one may travel even in countries where the railroad and the hotel are unknown. Yet I do not regret this experience, which at least taught me how few are the necessaries of life, and how needless are many of those things which we are accustomed to regard as such. Indeed, I am by no means certain that the absence of many luxuries which we commonly regard as indispensable to our happiness is not fully compensated for by the freedom from care and hurry, the continual variety of scenery and costume, and the sense of health produced by exposure to the open air, which, taken together, constitute the irresistible charm of Eastern travel. On the following morning we were up betimes, and after a steep ascent of an hour or so reached the summit of the pass of Zigona Dalg, which was thickly covered with a dazzling garment of snow. Here we passed a little khan, which would have been our second resting place had we halted at Javislik on the preceding day, instead of pushing on to Khamsekui. As it was, however, we passed it without stopping, and commenced the descent to the village of Zigonakui, where we halted for an hour to rest and refresh ourselves and the horses. Excellent fruit and coffee were obtainable here, and as we had yielded to the muleteer's request that we would not separate ourselves from the baggage, we had our own provisions as well, and altogether fared much better than on the previous day. After the completion of our meal, we proceeded on our journey, and towards evening reached the pretty little hamlet of Kypriboshi, situated on a river called, from the town of Ardessa through which it flows, Ardessa Irmaghi, in which we enjoyed the luxury of a bathe. The inhabitants of this delightful spot were few in number, peaceable in appearance, and totally devoid of that inquisitiveness about strangers which is so characteristic of the Persians. Although it can hardly be the case that many Europeans passed through their village, they scarcely looked at us, and asked but few questions as to our business, nationality, or destination. This lack of curiosity, which, so far as my experience goes, usually characterizes the Turkish peasant, extends to all his surroundings. Inquiries as to the name of a wayside flower, or the fate of a traveller whose last resting place was marked by a mound of earth at the roadside, were alike met with a half scornful, half amused "Kim bilir?" Who knows? Indicative of surprise on the part of the person addressed at being questioned on a matter in which, as it did not concern himself, he felt no interest. In Persia, more especially in southern Persia, it is quite otherwise, and, whether right or wrong, an ingenious answer is usually forthcoming to the traveller's inquiries. Our third day's march took us first through the town of Ardessa, and then through the village of Demirci Suyu, on emerging from which we were confronted and stopped by two most evil-looking individuals armed to the teeth with pistols and daggers. My first idea was that they were robbers, but on riding forward to ascertain their business, I discovered that they were excisemen of a kind called Diq Tabon, whose business it is to watch for and seize tobacco which does not bear the stamp of the Ottoman Regie. It appeared that someone, either from malice or a misdirected sense of humour, had laid information against us, alleging that we had in our possession a quantity of such tobacco. A violent altercation took place between the exciseman and our servant Ali, whose pockets they insisted on searching, and whose tobacco pouch was torn in two in the struggle. Meanwhile, the muleteers continued to manifest the most ostentatious eagerness to unload our baggage and submit it to examination, until finally, by protestations and remonstrances, we prevailed on the custom house officers to let us pass. The cause of the muleteers' unnecessary eagerness to open our baggage now became apparent. Sidling up to my horse, one of these honest fellows triumphantly showed me a great bag of smuggled tobacco, which he had secreted in his pocket. I asked him what he would have done if it had been detected, whereat he tapped the stock of a pistol which was thrust into his belt, with a sinister and suggestive smile. Although I could not help being amused at his cool impudence, I was far from being reassured by the warlike propensities which this gesture revealed. Continuing on our way, and still keeping near the river, we passed one or two old castles, situated on rocky heights, which, we were informed, had been built by the Genoese. Towards noon, we entered the valley of Gümüşhane, so called from the silver mines which occur in the neighbourhood. This valley is walled in by steep and rocky cliffs, and is barren and arid, except near the river, which is surrounded by beautiful orchards. Indeed, the pears and apples of Gümüşhane are celebrated throughout the district. We passed several prosperous-looking villages, at one of which we halted for lunch. Here, for the first time, I tasted petmez, a kind of treacle or syrup made from fruit. In Persia, this is known as dushab or shireh. It is not unpalatable, and we used occasionally to eat it with boiled rice as a substitute for pudding. Here also we fell in with a respectable-looking Armenian going on foot to Erzurum. Anyone worse equipped for a journey of 150 miles on foot I never saw. He wore a black frock coat and a fez. His feet were shod with slippers down at the heels, and to protect himself from the heat of the sun, he carried a large white umbrella. He looked so hot and tired and dusty, I was moved to compassion, and asked him whether he would not like to ride my horse for a while. This offer he gladly accepted, whereupon I dismounted and walked for a few miles, until he announced that he was sufficiently rested and would proceed on foot. He was so grateful for this indulgence that he bore us company as far as Erzurum, and would readily have followed us farther had we encouraged him to do so. Every day, H and myself allowed him to ride for some distance on our horses, and the poor man's journey was, I trust, thereby rendered less fatiguing to him. During the latter part of the day, our course lay through a most gloomy and desolate valley, walled in with red rocks and utterly devoid of trees or verdure. Emerging from this, and passing another fine old castle situated on a lofty and precipitous crag, we arrived about 5 p.m. at the little hamlet of Tekke, where we halted for the night. It is rather a miserable place, containing several khans swarming with Persian camel drivers, but very few private houses. A shallow river which runs near it again enabled us to enjoy the luxury of a bathe. Our fourth day's march was very dreary, lying for the most part through gloomy ravines walled in with reddish rocks, like that which we had traversed at the end of the previous day's journey. In addition to the depressing character of the scene, there was a report that robbers were lurking in the neighbourhood, and we were consequently joined by several pedestrians, all armed to the teeth, who sought safety in numbers. Shortly after noon, we halted at a small roadside inn, where we obtained some cheese and a not very savoury compound called kawurma, which consists of small square lumps of mutton embedded in fat. At 3 p.m. we reached the solitary khan of Qodarak, which was to be our halting place for the night. A few zabtiyers were lounging about outside, waiting for the post, which was expected to pass shortly. As it was still early, I went out into the balcony to write my diary and contemplate the somewhat cheerless view. But I was soon interrupted by our Armenian fellow traveller, who came to tell me that the zabtiyers outside were watching my proceedings with no favourable eye, and suspected that I was drawing maps of the country. He therefore advised me either to stop writing or to retire indoors, lest my diary should be seized and destroyed. Whether the Armenian spoke the truth, or whether he was merely indulging that propensity to revile the ruling race for which the Christian subjects of the Porte are conspicuous, I had no means of deciding. So I thought it best to follow his advice and retire from the balcony till I had completed my writing. Our 5th day's march led us through the interesting old Armenian village of Varzahan. Just before reaching this, we passed several horsemen who were engaged in wild and apparently purposeless evolutions, accompanied with much firing of guns. It appeared that these had come out to welcome the Qa'im Maqam of Diyauddin, who had been dismissed from office and was returning to his native town of Gyumish Khane, and we had scarcely passed them when he appeared in sight, met and passed us. I wished to examine the curious old churches which still bear witness that Varzahan, notwithstanding its present decayed condition, must formerly have been a place of some importance. Our Armenian fellow traveller offered to conduct me, and I was glad to avail myself of his guidance. After I had examined the strange construction of the churches, the Armenian inscriptions cut here and there on their walls, and the tombstones which surrounded them, amongst which were several carved in the form of a sheep, my companion suggested that we should try and obtain some refreshment. Although I was anxious to overtake our caravan, I yielded to his importunity, and followed him into a large and dimly lighted room, to which we only obtained admission after prolonged knocking. The door was at length opened by an old man, with whom my companion conversed for a while in Armenian, after he had bidden me to be seated. Presently, several other men, all armed to the teeth, entered the room, and seated themselves by the door. A considerable time elapsed, and still no signs of food appeared. The annoyance which I felt at this useless delay gradually gave way to a vague feeling of alarm. This was heightened by the fact that I was unable to comprehend the drift of the conversation, which was still carried on in Armenian. I began to wonder whether I had been enticed into a trap where I could be robbed at leisure, and to speculate on the chances of escape or resistance in case such an attempt should be made. I could not but feel that these were slender, for I had no weapon except a small pocket revolver. 5 or 6 armed men sat by the heavy wooden door, which had been closed, and, for anything that I knew, bolted. And even should I succeed in effecting an exit, I knew that our caravan must have proceeded a considerable distance. My apprehensions were, however, relieved by the appearance of a bowl of yogurt, curds, and a quantity of the insipid wafer-like bread called lavash. Having eaten, we rose to go, and when my companion, whom I had suspected of harbouring such sinister designs against my property and perhaps my life, refused to let me pay for our refreshment, I was filled with shame at my unwarranted suspicions. On emerging once more into the road, I found the faithful Ali patiently awaiting me. Perhaps he too had been doubtful of the honesty of the Armenian villagers. At any rate, he had refused to proceed without me. About 2 p.m. we arrived at the town of Bayburt, and found that H and the muleteers had already taken up their quarters at a clean and well-built khan owned by one Khalil Effendi. We at once proceeded to explore the town, which lies at the foot of a hill surmounted by an old fortress. Being too lazy to climb this hill, we contented ourselves with strolling through the bazaars, which form so important a feature of every eastern town, and afford so sure an index of the degree of prosperity which it enjoys. We were accompanied by the indefatigable Armenian, who, thinking to give me pleasure, exerted himself to collect a crowd of Persians, mostly natives of Khouy and Tabriz, whom he incited to converse with me. A throng of idlers soon gathered round us to gaze and gape at our unfamiliar aspect and dress, which some, bolder or less polite than the rest, stretched out their hands to finger and feel. Anxious to escape, I took refuge in a barber's shop and demanded a shave, but the crowd again assembled outside the open window and continued to watch the proceeding with sustained interest. Meanwhile, Ali had not been idle, and on our return to the khan we enjoyed better fare, as well as better quarters, than had fallen to our lot since we left Trebizond. Our 6th day's march commenced soon after daybreak. The early morning was chilly, but later on the sun shone forth in a cloudless sky, and the day grew hot. The first part of our way lay near the river which flows through Bayburt, and the scenery was a great improvement on anything that we had seen since leaving Gyumishkhane. We halted for our midday rest and refreshment by a clump of willow trees in a pleasant grassy meadow by the river. On resuming our march, we entered a narrow defile leading into the mountains of Kopdagh. A gradual ascent brought us to the summit of the pass, just below which, on the farther side, we came to our halting place, Pasha Punari. The view of the surrounding mountains standing out against the clear evening sky was very beautiful, and the little khan at which we alighted was worthy of its delightful situation. We were lodged in a sort of barn, in which was stored a quantity of hay. How fragrant and soft it seemed! I still think of that night's sleep as one of the soundest and sweetest in my experience. Early on the morning of the 7th day, we resumed our march along a circuitous road, which, after winding downwards amongst grassy hills, followed the course of a river surrounded by stunted trees. We saw numerous large birds of the falcon kind, called by the Turks dogan. One of these H brought down with his rifle while it was hovering in the air, to the great delight of the muleteers. At a village called Oshqal'a, we purchased honey, bread, and grapes, which we consumed while halting for the midday rest by an old bridge. Continuing on our way by the river, we were presently joined by a turbaned and genial Turk, who was travelling on horseback from Gyumishkhane to Erzurum. I was pleased to hear him use, in the course of conversation, certain words which I had hitherto only met with in the writings of the old poet Fuzuli of Baghdad, and which I had regarded as archaic and obsolete. The road gradually became more frequented than it had been since leaving Bayburt, and we passed numerous travellers and peasants. Many of the latter drove bullock carts, of which the ungreased axles sent forth the most excruciating sound. The sun had set before we reached our halting place, Yeni Khan, and so full was it that we had some difficulty in securing a room to ourselves. End of section 3. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. Recorded in London, England.